Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm Sam Albanese from the National Weather Service. Excuse me. Excuse me. And today we see a continuation of the generally benign weather for this time of year for Alaska. We're dominated by low pressure that's in the eastern Gulf of Alaska, and that's causing some issues down in southeast Alaska with respect to some wind and rain. Then we also have a low pressure system south of the Aleutian Islands, but it's not really having a major impact there. We do have yet another system that'll move into the picture in the western Aleutian Islands with high pressure dominating the Arctic Ocean. To start with, we'll take a look at our satellite imagery and we can see what's going on here. One of the things to note is we do have this northwesterly flow coming down across the Alaska Peninsula causing some windy conditions. You kind of see some breaks in the clouds there south of the eastern Alaska Peninsula. And then here's our next system that's going to be moving on up into the picture as we start this loop in motion again. And you can see this system is moving on up towards the western Aleutian Islands. That's going to bring some windy, wet conditions to the western Aleutian Islands in the next couple of days. Taking a look at the satellite imagery over the Gulf of Alaska itself, here's our low pressure system sitting off of southeast Alaska, and that was generally rotating clouds on into the Panhandle. Rainy weather was dominant throughout the southern two-thirds of the Panhandle, becoming somewhat showery. We did see some clouds that were basically moving in from the east across the eastern interior, and then we had this trough of low pressure that basically extended across the interior, not really having a major impact on the weather. Did produce some showers up towards the Kotzebue Sound area in that western portion of western interior region of the state. So here's our surface map for today. Low pressure, as I said, was off of southeast Alaska, and fortunately for southeast Alaska, the strongest winds with this low are basically offshore. So it was generally just a rainy day and cloudy day down in southeast Alaska with this low pressure system. Weak low pressure along the North Gulf Coast really didn't have much of an impact at all. In fact, it was generally pretty sunny throughout the Prince William Sound area, up into the over to the Kenai Peninsula, up on into the Susitna Valley. Even the majority of the Copper River Basin was generally cloud-free, and portions of the eastern Tanana Valley. We did see some breaks in the clouds over western Alaska down into the Bristol Bay area along the Killbuck Mountains, and then up along the basically the middle Yukon River Valley in that St. Mary's area. And then here's that trough of low pressure that those clouds were a reflection of over the western interior, some scattered shower activity there. Along the Arctic coast, even though there was high pressure, it tended to keep things generally cloudy, low clouds, some foggy type conditions, even some flurries in that area. A ridge of high pressure over the eastern Bering Sea basically kept things on the benign side there, somewhat cloudy, but generally calm conditions. Trough of low pressure extending up into the central Aleutian Islands resulted in some rain showers there. And then we had weak low pressure up into the northwestern Bering Sea and some rain showers associated with that. By tonight, we expect our low pressure system off southeast Alaska to kind of push towards the Panhandle a little bit. That'll push some of the winds into southeast Alaska. Showery and rainy conditions can be expected basically from Juneau south. There's a chance of some showers as you move on up towards the Haines and Skagway area. Along the North Gulf Coast over by Yakutat, generally cloudy conditions, slim chance that you may see a shower or two there. Along the North Gulf Coast, expect an increase in clouds there. So, clear conditions are going to persist over the Cook Inlet region on up into the Susitna Valley, down into that Bristol Bay area as well as across Kodiak Island. Very dry conditions for this time of year. One of the things of note with the northwesterly and northerly winds blowing across basically southwestern Alaska and that Katmai area, that was resuspending some ash from the that eruption many years ago, and there was some trace amounts that were reported over towards Karluk on the Shelikof Strait side of Kodiak Island. Generally expect mostly cloudy conditions along the Alaska Peninsula. Some rain is possible over the eastern Aleutian Islands to the central Aleutian Islands. If it happens, should be pretty light. Changing our focus up to the Arctic coast, basically with the high pressure over the Arctic Ocean, it's pushing those lower clouds in along the coast. You may see some flurries or isolated snow showers, even the possibility of some very patchy localized freezing drizzle, and also expect your typical foggy conditions with high pressure dominating along that Arctic slope region. Out into the Aleutian Islands, extreme western Aleutian Islands that is, here's our next low pressure system moving into the picture. It's turning out to be a moderately vigorous low, expecting some wind and rain as that moves on into the picture or through tomorrow and Thursday. Taking a look now at the forecast for Wednesday. Southeast Alaska, we have this low pressure system persisting along the eastern Gulf of Alaska, pushing the showers up through portions of the Panhandle. Probably even going to see some showers in the southern Panhandle. Windy conditions are also expected throughout Southeast Alaska in association with this low. Along the North Gulf Coast, generally cloudy conditions, sunny conditions through the Copper River Basin down through Cook Inlet to Kodiak Island, cloudy conditions across the Alaska Peninsula as well as much of the interior. There's a chance of some flurries or snow showers along the Arctic coast, and also expect the foggy conditions to be prevailing in the morning hours, actually probably well into the afternoon. Taking a look at the Bering Sea on Wednesday, strong low pressure system pushing that front across the central and western Aleutian Islands. Windy, wet conditions can be expected with this storm moving into the western Aleutian Islands on Wednesday. Taking a look at the forecast now for Thursday. Expect southeast Alaska to be generally cloudy and showery throughout the day. The low pressure system is drifting off to the south and east, but you're going to continue to see the moisture associated with that coming across the Panhandle. Cloudy conditions along the North Gulf Coast, a chance of some showers in western Prince William Sound, a chance of rain over Kodiak Island. Probably going to see some sunny conditions over the northern Cook Inlet region into the southern Susitna Valley. Otherwise, generally pretty cloudy conditions throughout the majority of the state. Up along the Arctic coast, still expect a chance of some snow or flurries with generally foggy conditions persisting along the north slopes of the Brooks Range to the Arctic coast. Out into the Bering Sea, our low pressure system basically is going to stay south of the Aleutian Islands. It's going to push the front towards the Alaska Peninsula. Expect rain to be spreading to the western Alaska Peninsula late in the day Thursday. Rain persisting across the eastern Aleutian Islands. Rain over the central Aleutian Islands becoming more showery in that strong north-northwesterly flow. Same thing for the western Aleutian Islands. Strong north-northwesterly flow with showery type conditions is what you should expect during the day on Thursday. Taking a look at our temperatures around the state today. Southeast Alaska temperatures generally in the upper 40s to low 50s. Low 50s to mid 50s in Prince William Sound, 40s throughout Cook Inlet, 30s in the Copper River Basin, 20s and 30s as we move on up into the eastern interior with some temperatures hovering right around the freezing mark over the western interior. Up towards the Arctic coast, temperatures were generally in the the 20s throughout the area. Up in the Brooks Range, 19 degrees up in the Adigan Pass area, and as I said, 30s across that eastern interior. Over towards the Seward Peninsula, temperatures in the 20s and 30s around that Seward Peninsula area, 30s along the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coast, and as we move on down towards southwestern Alaska and the Bristol Bay area, temperatures generally in the 30s, although Port Ellsworth and the Iliamna area were in the low 40s there, mid 40s across Kodiak Island, across the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s to low 40s, upper 30s in the Pribilof Islands with temperatures in the low 40s in the Dutch Harbor on Alaska area, and across the Aleutian Islands, temperatures were in the mid 40s today. For our low temperatures for tonight, expect southeast Alaska to generally be in the upper 30s to low 40s, so really not a big change from the temperatures that you've been seeing. Temperatures along the North Gulf Coast and south central Alaska dropping down into that freezing range again, 20s in the Copper River Basin, teens and 20s over the eastern interior portions of the state, single digits up along the Brooks Range, temperatures remaining in the 20s up along the Arctic coast, teens and 20s in the Kotzebue Sound area to 20s in the Norton Sound area. Temperatures in the 20s over southwestern Alaska down to Bristol Bay, with temperatures staying basically in the 30s across the Alaska Peninsula, mid-30s in the Pribilof Islands to upper 30s as we move on down towards Alaska, and temperatures staying in the low to mid-40s across the Aleutian Islands for tonight. Taking a look at our highs for tomorrow, expect southeast Alaska to see temperatures very similar to what you were experiencing today, upper 40s to low 50s throughout the Panhandle. May even see a few temperatures get into the mid-50s. North Gulf Coast temperatures, again, very similar to what we saw today, generally in the 40s, 30s in the Copper River Basin, 20s and 30s over that eastern interior region. Up towards the Arctic coast, expect your temperatures to stay in the 20s to low 30s, teens in the Brooks Range again. Moving over towards the Seward Peninsula, expect your temperatures in the upper 20s to low 30s there, low 30s around the Norton Sound area, low 30s over the Kuskokwim Delta to the mid to upper 30s as we move on down to Bristol Bay, 40s across the Alaska Peninsula as well as the eastern Aleutian Islands, low 40s in the Pribilof Islands, and temperatures out across the Aleutian Islands themselves, central and western Aleutian Islands. A lot of warm air coming with that next storm system, upper 40s to low 50s are what you can anticipate for tomorrow there. Taking a look at our flying weather for tomorrow. Marginal conditions throughout southeast Alaska and that showery type weather. Some marginal conditions over that eastern interior, the eastern Tanana Valley, with a chance of some snow in that area. Up along the Arctic coast, generally marginal conditions can be expected with the flurries or snow showers and foggy type conditions. And as we move on out to the Bering Sea, expect marginal conditions basically from Unalaska to the central Aleutian Islands, with IFR conditions prevalent over the western Aleutian Islands for tomorrow. Taking a look at our passes, expect marginal conditions for Anaktuvuk Pass on the north side of the path. Same thing for Adigan Pass, marginal conditions on the north side of the path as well. Down to the Alaska Range, expect VFR conditions for both Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, VFR conditions for Rainy Pass as well as Windy Pass. Expect VFR conditions for Isabel Pass as well as Mentasta Pass. Down to the Chugach Mountains, expect VFR conditions for Tanita Pass as well as Portage Pass. And as we move on over to southeast Alaska and Chilkoot and White Pass, marginal conditions, sometimes VFR, but predominantly marginal conditions are what you should expect for tomorrow through those passes. For our freezing levels for tomorrow, basically at the surface throughout the state north of the Alaska Range, as we move on over towards the Gulf of Alaska, the freezing level is sloping up between to 2,000 to 4,000 feet down into southeast Alaska, about a 2,000 foot freezing level over the Alaska Peninsula. And as we move on out into the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands, your freezing levels sloping on up to about 4,000 to 6,000 feet over the western Aleutian Islands. For our icing for tomorrow, down in southeast Alaska, occasional moderate rime icing can be expected from your freezing level to 15,000 feet, with the amount of moisture associated with that low expected to impact the Panhandle. And then out across the Aleutian Islands, expect from over the central and western Aleutian Islands, occasional moderate mixed icing can be expected with that next system coming in from your freezing level to about 18,000 feet. Taking a look now at our jet stream for tomorrow. The jet stream starts off at about 125 knots south of the Kamchatka Peninsula, comes on across the Aleutian Islands, tapering off to about 95 knots as we get down into the southern Gulf or south of the Gulf of Alaska, and keeps moving on over towards the Vancouver Island area at about 95 knots. Taking a look now down to the 9,000 foot level. Over the mainland, generally pretty calm conditions as you would anticipate, since the action is where the lows are. That's where your strongest winds are going to be. So southeast Alaska, 25 to 35 knot winds south of that low towards that Dixon entrance area, tapering off to about 15 knots across much of the Panhandle itself. Moving on out to the Aleutian Islands, with that next system coming in, some pretty strong winds south of that low pressure system, 65 to 70 knots south of that low, right over the western Aleutian Islands, tapering off to 15 to 25 knots as we get over the ridge of high pressure, with 20 knot winds coming across the western Alaska Peninsula. And up along the Arctic coast, about 15 to 20 knot winds can be expected at that 9,000 foot level. Now taking a look at the 3,000 foot level, again over the mainland, generally pretty light winds throughout the mainland of the state, some 20 knot winds along the coast of the Arctic coast. Down into southeast Alaska, 15 to 20 knot winds across the Panhandle, right around that low in the outer coastal areas, about 30 knot winds can be expected there. And then out into the Aleutian Islands, Well, not a lot of winds across the Alaska Peninsula, about 10 to 15 knots there. Same thing for the eastern Aleutian Islands. But as we move on over towards where our low pressure system is out in the western Aleutian Islands, expect about 35 knots over the central Aleutian, 50 knots over the western Aleutian Islands, and 70 knots just south of the western Aleutian Islands associated with that low pressure system. Taking a look now at our turbulence, the only real area of concern for turbulence is going to be over where that strong low pressure system is moving into the picture out in the western Aleutian Islands. Occasional to widespread moderate turbulence below that 3,500 foot level over those areas. That wraps up this portion of the show. Enjoy the segment and come back for the marine forecast.
Her name is Patty Wagstaff, one of the most celebrated aerobatic pilots of all time. Three-time U.S. National Aerobatic Champion, she is the first woman to win this title. Because of her achievements, Patty has been honored by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum as a pioneer of flight, and her Goodrich Extra 260 aircraft occupies the same gallery at the Smithsonian as Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Vega.
I have to admit, what I do seems like a pretty dangerous way to make a living. I suppose that's part of the appeal, why so many people come out to see me fly, and to see me take these risks. But, as fellow pilots, I'll let you in on a little secret. There's risk, all right. As you know, anytime you climb into an aircraft, there's risk. But over the years, I've learned to minimize that risk by careful preparation, training, planning, common sense, and constant situational awareness. Attention to safety keeps me alive in the air. But safety doesn't begin at the top of an inverted loop. Safety begins on the ground before you get in your airplane.
As pilots, most of us have seen a great deal of change in airport operations over the past few years. Today, there are nearly 70 million tower operations annually, and the number is growing each year. Pilots are challenged with more and more complex air traffic procedures, more complicated airport layout design. More and more, it is an environment of very real risk. But just as Patty Wagstaff has developed strategies for mitigating risk in the air, pilots can do the same on the ground by following standard procedures, such as using airport diagrams and planning their taxi routes.
The great majority of runway incursions are caused by pilot error. And the great majority of those errors, more than 70%, are caused by general aviation pilots. Those of us who have been flying for a while remember that they didn't teach us much about runway safety back in the days when we were in training. In recent years, that's changed. The FAA has developed a number of educational programs and strategies to help pilots improve runway safety. In fact, with more than 650,000 pilots and more than 240,000 aircraft all conducting millions of operations around the clock, it's amazing how safe our airports are. But still, with the best of training, collisions can happen at any airport, at any time, to any pilot. We may be good pilots, but we are also human. And sometimes we make very human mistakes.
And ground Cessna 9308. Say again.
Runway incursions are most often the result of a loss of situational awareness. For a variety of reasons, the pilot becomes confused by the airport's signs and layout, or doesn't listen to or understand the controller's instructions, or simply fails to follow instructions.
Cessna 3 Sierra Papa.
Hold short, runway 26 left.
452 Sierra Papa, hold short, runway 26 left.
Cessna 3 Sierra Papa, you're over the whole line.
Often this is because he or she is unfamiliar with the airport, the pilot's fatigued, or is distracted by something in the cockpit.
You know what I was doing last night?
For a few critical seconds, pilots lose track of where they are in relation to their surroundings.
You can imagine how important it is for me to focus on situational awareness. In the air, my life depends on it. If I don't know precisely where I am and where I'm going, and the tasks required to get me there, the consequences could be catastrophic. And the same goes for you and for me on the ground.
One of the first keys to situational awareness is attention to detail even before you start your engine. Just as we always study area charts and weather information before we fly, it's important to be thoroughly familiar with the airport's layout before we taxi. Every airport is different, so it's important to obtain and study airport diagrams. Pay particular attention to complex or confusing runway and taxiway intersections and runway thresholds. Some airports publish hotspots on their airport diagrams. For example, intersections, where pilots should be especially vigilant. Obviously, we should make a similar study of the airport at our destination. Once you are thoroughly familiar with the airport layout, make sure you review the signs you will encounter as you taxi toward the active runway. Some simple phrases can help you remember what the signs mean. Black square, you're there. These black signs tell you which runway or taxiway you're on right now. Yellow array points the way. These yellow signs with black arrows point you toward a runway or a taxiway or toward a destination, such as a ramp. If you see white numerals on a red sign, remember, red and white, runways in sight. This type of sign shows the hold position for the runway. Remember, yellow markings represent taxiways and white markings represent runways.
Welcome back, and now let's take a look at our marine forecast for Southeast Alaska on Wednesday. With that low pressure system sitting off the coast there, it's going to produce some pretty strong winds along the outer coastal waters, about 30 to 35 knots out of the south-southeast to eventually out of the east, although along the east Gulf Coast, only 15 knots there. In the southern inside waters, expect your winds to be out of the southeast, about 30 knots. Up in the Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area, the typical strong channeled wind coming down through that area at about 35 knots. Taking a look at that area for Thursday, we could see that the winds are going to drop off a bit up in the Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area to 25 knots, staying at that 20 knot level in the southern inside waters, 20 to 25 knots in the southern outside waters, about 30 knots as we move on up to just offshore, off of the Sitka area, and about 25 knots along that east Gulf Coast out of the east. Taking a look at the south central region, generally very benign weather as you would expect from our previous discussion with the maps. Variable winds at 10 knots across Prince William Sound and the North Gulf Coast. Northerly winds around 10 knots down Cook Inlet to northwesterly winds across the Barren Islands at about 10 to 15 knots. And around Kodiak Island, variable winds at 10 knots in that Shelikof Strait area with northwesterly 15 knots south of Kodiak Island. On Thursday, expect your winds to be light and variable in Prince William Sound once again, increasing to 15 to 20 knots out of the east across the North Gulf Coast, 15 knots across the Barren Islands out of the east. Same thing across the Kodiak Island area, east winds 15 knots, and northeast winds 10 knots up in the Cook Inlet region. Taking a look now at the Alaska Peninsula on Wednesday, expect your winds to be out of the north, 15 knots in Bristol Bay, as well as on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. Northwesterly winds 15 knots south of the western Alaska Peninsula, with northwesterly 20-knot winds south of the eastern Alaska Peninsula. By Thursday, expect your winds to be coming more out of the southeast and east, 15 knots from south of the Alaska Peninsula to that Bristol Bay area, and expect your winds to be out of the east-northeast 20 knots over the western Alaska Peninsula waters. Taking a look at the Aleutian Islands on Wednesday. Generally speaking, about 20-knot winds over the eastern Aleutian Island region, variable in the wind direction. Southerly winds west of Nikolsky, east on the north side of the basically that eastern Aleutian Islands there north of Unalaska, north to northeast 15 knots south of the Unalaska area. Expect your winds to be out of the south and southwest about 25 knots over the central Aleutian Islands. And as we move on out to the western Aleutian Islands, expect your winds to be out of the southwest, gale force winds 35 knots there. Taking a look at the area on Thursday, once that low kind of pushes off to the east, winds are going to come around the backside of the low North winds about 35 to 40 knots over the western Aleutian Islands. Expect your winds to also be out of the north about 30 to 35 knots over the central Aleutian Islands, and expect your winds to be out of the northeast and east about 25 to 30 knots as we move over the eastern Aleutian Island region. Taking a look now at the Bering Sea coastal waters for Wednesday. Expect your winds out of the east 15 knots in the Pribilof Islands to 20 knots as we move on up to the St. Matthew Island region, and northeast 20 knots over the St. Lawrence Island area. And around the Nunivak Island waters, expect your winds out of the north at 15 knots. For Thursday, expect those winds to be northeasterly over that Nunivak Island region at 15 knots. North winds 20 knots in the St. Lawrence Island area to 25 knots as we move on to the St. Matthew Island area, and north winds 25 knots in the Pribilof Islands. Taking a look at your Arctic coastal waters for Wednesday, expect your winds to be out of the east across the majority of the Arctic coast, basically from Kaktovik all the way to the west, about 25 to 30 knots. And then as we move on over towards the northwest Arctic coast and outside of Kotzebue Sound, northeast to north winds 25 to 15 knots respectively. Taking a look at the area for Thursday, expect your winds to be 20 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound out of the northeast, 25 knot northeasterly winds over the Cape Lisburn area, with east winds around 30 knots, basically from Point Leon over to Prudhoe Bay, and then 25 knot easterly winds as we move on over towards that Kaktovik area. For a quick recap for tonight, we have that small but potent low pressure system off of southeast Alaska, some windy conditions in the outer coastal areas as well as the southern inside waters, and rain or showery type conditions can be expected there. Generally clear conditions over the south central region down to Kodiak Island. Chance of some snow showers in that eastern interior, some scattered snow showers along the Arctic coast, even some patchy areas of freezing drizzle, as well as some fog problems there. Out into the Bering Sea, we start to see our next low pressure system coming into the picture, and by Wednesday you can see it's pretty much into the western Aleutian Islands. Pretty potent low pressure system. It's going to produce some windy conditions as well as wet conditions over the central to western Aleutian Islands, potentially even spreading the rain to the eastern Aleutian Islands. The Pribilof Islands even have a chance of mixed rain and snow for Wednesday. But that about wraps up the show for this evening. Thank you for watching and have a good evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.